This evening there was a patient I could not place. He was not entered on any surgeon's list, and yet he moved as if he had always belonged to the wards. He visited each room without hurry, without speaking, only standing where the lantern light thinned. I watched him go, and the men who were wakeful watched also, though none of us named it aloud. The page is not torn, not burned, not smudged by rain the way so many field papers are. It is only pressed too hard, as if the hand that wrote those lines did not trust itself to keep steady. I remember the first time I read that entry by lamplight, how the flame made a small, private weather in the room, and how the words seemed to cool the air around them. Gettysburg is a name Americans speak clearly, like a bell. But the hospitals after Gettysburg are spoken of less often, as if they belong to another country. One built from boards laid across pews, from barn floors, from college halls made into wards, from tents pitched where we'd have been standing only days before. In those places, the war did not end on July 3rd. It simply changed its manner. In the weeks after the battle, Pennsylvania College, what we now call Gettysburg College, was turned into a vast makeshift hospital, and Pennsylvania Hall in particular held hundreds of wounded men, with rooms and hallways crowded until there was no clean boundary between corridor and sickroom National Museum of Civil War Medicine. A student returning to his room described finding it ample accommodation for 3, 1 on the bed and 2 on the floor, and noted that rooms, halls, and passageways were filled with soldiers' National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It is easy, from a distance of years, to imagine these hospitals only as places of suffering and labor, necessary, grim, straightforward. Yet anyone who has read the letters and recollections of the women who nursed there knows another truth. The hospital was also a place of listening. It was a place where a person learned the difference between the sound of a man sleeping and the sound of a man fading. It was a place where you could tell, by the way a stretcher was carried, whether its burden was living or dead, an observation preserved in the nursing writings from that summer the woodlands. It was a place where women, many without formal training, but with steady hands and a steadier willingness, wrote letters for strangers who could no longer hold a pencil, and signed names they had known only for an hour. In July of 1863, one young nurse, Cornelia Hancock, arrived to find churches converted into hospitals. Men laid on boards across pews so tightly packed that, as she put it, their drawn faces rose almost her own height, as if she stood breast-high in a sea of anguish New York Times archive. She wrote of moving from pallet to pallet through the night, writing final messages to families who would never see the handwriting again in New York Times archive. Another volunteer, Emily Bliss Souter, came later in July and described a strange educational place, how the work wore grooves into the mind, until sorrow became routine, and routine became its own kind of danger, the woodlands. The nurses spoke of mothers' names called out in the dark, of small kindnesses, locks of hair cut for a family far away, oak leaves gathered from branches above a dying boy's tent of woodlands. And then, amid those plain, well-attested labors, there appear in scattered records a quieter thread, not a story told loudly, not a thing claimed as certain. Only remarks made the way a careful person makes remarks when she knows she is already close to the edge of what can be borne. A visitor, a patient, a man whose name did not appear on the list, who moved through each ward as if searching for something he had mislaid, or confirming something he did not wish to see confirmed. The hospitals at Gettysburg were not one building, but many: churches, homes, barns, the college campus, and later the larger organized tent hospital that would gather the wounded into one place. The ground itself seemed given over to rows, rows of beds, rows of stretchers, rows of lanterns. And where there are rows, there are patterns. Where there are patterns, people begin, without meaning to notice what is not fit. The entry I quoted at the beginning is not famous. It is not framed in a museum. It survives only as a copied fragment in a bundle of other pages, the kind of thing families kept because throwing it away felt like a second death. It is also the sort of fragment that makes you read slower, not faster, because in a hospital, in the weeks after Gettysburg, It was entirely possible for a stranger to appear and be overlooked. Men were transferred without notice. Records were delayed. A new wagon could arrive at night. A chaplain could move between wards. A surgeon could bring in a case no one else had seen. And yet the nurse who wrote that line did not call him a surgeon or a minister or a messenger. She called him a patient. Outside, the Pennsylvania summer lay heavy on the town. A humid heat that could not be escaped, no matter how thick the shade. A haze that turned distant trees into smudged ink. Flies that found every sweetness and every wound. And in that air, so often described by witnesses as oppressive, thick, hard to breathe, people learned the weight of things left unspoken. New York Times archive. The hospitals were full of men who could not sleep, not only because of pain, but because sleep in such a place meant surrendering awareness, letting the mind drift where it might meet memories it could not command. In the corners of Pennsylvania Hall, lanterns guttered. In tents near the edge of town, canvas snapped in night wind like a sail adjusting itself without a hand. And the nurse, anonymous in my telling, though she was as real as any, began to notice a simple, repeating difficulty, that a certain figure seemed to know the arrangement of the wards. Not like someone asking directions, not like a new arrival trying to find his bed, but like someone returning to rooms he had already visited, quietly, methodically, one after another. And when she tried later to trace his name in the list, she found nothing written down that matched, only that on nights when the lamps burned low and the men's voices thinned, there were always one or two patients awake enough to watch the doorway, watching as they expected someone, not a nurse, not a surgeon, someone else. And if you asked them what they were listening for, they would shake their heads and say they did not know. But their eyes would remain fixed on the dark beyond the ward, as though the hall itself had begun to breathe. The town that July did not feel like a place that belonged to any season. It felt borrowed, as if Gettysburg had been set aside from ordinary time and turned toward a single use. The first difficulty for anyone trying to describe the hospitals after battle is that there were too many of them, and they changed too quickly. A church could be a sanctuary in the morning and a ward by noon. A private parlor could become a surgeon's station before dusk. A college building, meant for recitations and polite footsteps, could become, within hours, a corridor of men laid close together, their breath forming a soft, uneven weather along the floorboards. At Pennsylvania College, the campus sat in the northwestern corner of town, just far enough from the central square to feel slightly removed, and yet close enough that the war could not be kept out by distance alone. The cupola of Pennsylvania Hall, built for outlook and pride, had been used by Union signal officers at the opening of the battle, guided there by a professor of chemistry and mathematics, Michael Jacobs, to survey the surrounding land National Museum of Civil War Medicine. The same building, days later, was crowded with wounded men, and the halls were no longer for study, but for waiting for dressings, for transport, for the next wagon, for a name to be called or not called. One student wrote of returning to his room and finding it already occupied, one man on the bed, two on the floor, and then, as if the sentence could not contain all of it, he added that the rooms, halls, and hallways were full National Museum of Civil War Medicine. That kind of remark, plain, almost weary, is the closest thing we have to measure the place. Numbers do not carry the weight of a hallway you cannot walk through without turning sideways. There were Confederate wounded left behind in Pennsylvania Hall because they were judged too unstable to move. Confederate medical men stayed with them, and then Union surgeons and nurses arrived and worked alongside them the first strange calm after the fighting National Museum of Civil War Medicine. In such a mingling, identities blurred. Men who had tried to kill one another days earlier now shared water, shared bandages, shared the same stale air. Later, the great tent hospital was established near Gettysburg, capable, according to a period caption, of accommodating about 3,000 wounded soldiers. Library of Congress. When you look at the old photograph, wounded men gathered in front of tents, two female nurses present, the whole scene held still by the camera's long stare. You could almost feel how temporary it all was, and yet how it had the force, permanence, and necessity Library of Congress. Canvas walls do not keep sound from traveling. They do not keep the night from entering. They only make the boundaries visible. Many nurses came from far away, called by newspapers, by family ties, by the U.S. Sanitary Commission, by churches, by that peculiar American urge to arrive at the place where the nation's suffering had gathered. Some were young, some were older, some were approved, some not, and some simply slipped through on the strength of need. Cornelia Hancock, only 23, wrote about being judged too young by Dorothea Dix in Baltimore, then riding onward anyway because the need at Gettysburg made argument seem ridiculous. New York Times archive. She wrote of entering a church hospital and seeing men laid on boards across pews, faces raised close to her own, and she tried to describe in a way that did not sound like an exaggeration, a sea of anguish. Breast-high New York Times archive. She spent nights writing letters for soldiers who could not hold a pencil, sending last messages home with words that were not her own, and yet had to pass through her hand. Emily Bliss Souter, arriving July 15th, wrote letters and poems about the work, and in one late-night passage, she described finishing a letter to a dead soldier's mother and enclosing a lock of black hair and oak leaves from a branch over the tent. Small relics meant to make distance bearable to woodlands. Her words show how the hospital became an assembly of quiet rituals, washing, feeding, writing, listening, and then starting again. The nurse whose fragment began this story worked in that same world, a world where lantern oil mattered, where water had to be carried, where linens were never enough, where the floorboards recorded everything. She did not leave us a name we could be sure of, only a handwriting, a few dates, and a habit of noting what she could verify. That habit is important, because the thing she recorded next is not a flourish. It is not a ghost story written to entertain. It reads like an uncomfortable addition to an otherwise orderly log. At first, she wrote of ordinary matters, the arrival of wagons, the condition of the men, the arguments between surgeons and volunteer helpers, the shortage of hands, the smoke from cooking fires, the heat pressing down. She wrote of how, in the early morning, the building sounded almost peaceful, only the soft coughs, the rasp of breath, the occasional murmur of a name. She wrote of flies and the way water left rings on the wood. Then, beginning in the second week of her entries, the same small detail appeared 3 times, spaced days apart, never described with more certainty than she could hold. A man in the corridor, not a surgeon, not a steward, not a chaplain, no Bible, no visible bundle of letters. A patient, he walked with measured slowness, not the halting gait of an injured man necessarily, but the careful pace of someone who knew that noise carried. He did not ask for water. He did not ask for a nurse. He did not take a seat. He simply stopped at the threshold of each ward. In an ordinary hospital, such behavior might have been dismissed as wandering. Fever, shock, the many forms confusion takes after battle. But what troubled her was not the walking. It was the pattern. He visited each ward, not twice, not in circles, not in a hurry, as if the building were a list, and he was checking it. The first time she saw him, she assumed he belonged to another part of the hospital and had lost his way. She watched him until he passed out of sight, then returned to her work. The second time, she asked a hospital steward if he recognized a man. The steward frowned and said there were too many to keep straight. The third time, she wrote the line that had survived. He was not entered on any surgeon's list, and yet he moved as if he had always belonged to the wards. It is one thing to have too many names. It is another thing to have a man with no name at all. When you have spent days writing letters for dying strangers, names become anchors. They are how you prove a man existed beyond the bed he occupies. They are how you send word to a mother, a wife, a sister. They are how you keep the hospital from becoming a single anonymous mass of suffering. So when the nurse could not find his name, it felt like a small tear in the fabric of the place. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to and declared. Just a thin, persistent wrongness. And when she began to mention him, carefully, to one other nurse, and later to a convalescent soldier who seemed lucid. She found, to her discomfort, that she was not the first to notice. A private from Pennsylvania said he had seen a fellow standing in the doorway at dusk, blocking the lantern glow, and that he thought it was an officer until the man stepped aside and made no sound. A Confederate, feverish but clear-eyed, said there was a man that goes by when the ward is quiet. A matron said she had assumed it was a chaplain who did not speak much. No one agreed on who he was, only that he went through, ward by ward, and that the air felt colder in the doorway after he left, as if the hall had carried in a different draft. In the hospitals after Gettysburg, there were 1,000 explanations for strange impressions: exhaustion, hunger, grief, the heat's oppression, the night's distortions, the way lantern light makes faces untrustworthy. Any careful witness would admit that. The nurse admitted it too, in the small, sober way she wrote, never insisting, never claiming, only recording. And that is where the slow unease began, not with certainty but with repetition, not with terror, but with the simple fact that a pattern had started to form. The hospital had its own hours, different from the town's. Outside, Gettysburg tried, awkwardly, to resume ordinary life. Carts began to move again. Some shops opened. Farmers walked their fields with a careful slowness, stepping around the places where the ground had been torn. But inside the wards, day and night were measured by need. The sounding of a distant bugle, the arrival of a wagon, the changing of dressings, the giving of water, the writing of letters. In such a place, the mind becomes a clerk. It sorts details to survive. It notes what is useful and discards what cannot be acted upon. That is why the nurse's attention to the unnamed visitor is so telling. She did not write pages of speculation. She wrote small notations, an added sentence at the end of the day's account, a line in the margin, a brief remark that reads like she wished she could omit it. On the first occasion, she wrote only that a patient had been out of place in the corridor at dusk. On the second, she noted that he stood in the doorway of Ward C so long that a convalescent man asked him if he was waiting for someone. According to the convalescent, the visitor did not answer. He turned his head slightly, as though listening to something beyond the room, and then moved on. The nurse's account is not the only thread. In the same weeks, the published nursing recollections from Gettysburg speak repeatedly about the difficulty of order, the scarcity of surgeons, the mass of wounded, the sense that the normal machinery of care had been overwhelmed. New York Times archive. In those conditions, it was entirely possible for one man to slip between categories. But the uneasy detail remained. The visitor did not behave like a man lost in categories. He behaved like someone with a purpose, not the feverish purpose of delirium, but the quiet purpose of someone who knows the route. The nurses began, without saying so aloud, to alter small parts of their routine. The night lamp was turned higher. The corridor lantern was kept lit longer than the oil allowance would usually allow. A nurse who would ordinarily walk alone to the wash basin asked another to come with her. None of these actions were dramatic. They were the small adjustments people make when they feel watched, even if they cannot defend that feeling to themselves. One evening, a soldier in Ward B, an older man, steady, not given to fussing, asked for his letters to be read back to him. The nurse assumed he wanted reassurance that his words were correct. But after she finished, she said quietly, "If anyone comes, tell him I am not here." She asked, "Who do you mean?" He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the doorway. She wrote that line down later, because it struck her as odd, not the words alone, but the way he said them, like a man speaking of a debt. A second witness was a hospital steward who had been detailed to carry water and dispose of refuse. He told one of the matrons that he had seen a man in a patient's shirt standing at the end of the hall, facing the stairs. The steward called out, thinking he was about to collapse, but the man turned and went into the shadow, and the steward, who swore he had been wide awake, could not afterward be sure whether the man had gone down the stairs or simply merged with the dark. The third witness was less steady, a young Confederate, taken prisoner and left behind because he could not be moved, who spoke in a low voice late at night. He asked for water, drank a little, then said, "He comes through like counting." The nurse asked what he meant. He said, "Like counting the living." Then he closed his eyes, as if he had said too much. In the hospital world, metaphors often emerge without intention. Men spoke in the language of farms and shops and sermons. They used the words they had, and sometimes those words were the only way to approach what they felt. Counting the living. The nurse did not write that phrase immediately. She wrote it 2 days later, as if she had not wanted to grant a place on the page. When she did write it, she did not add explanation, only the date, only the ward, only that it was said. The physical place contributed to the unease in ways that did not require any mystery. Pennsylvania Hall, crowded with men, had sounds that traveled strangely. A cough in one room could be heard as a whisper in another. Footsteps on the stair could be mistaken for footsteps in the corridor. In summer heat, doors were kept open when possible, and the building breathed with drafts. And yet, the nurses began to notice a particular sequence. First, a pause in the room's ordinary noise, like a moment when even the flies seemed to still. Second, the sense of figure at the doorway, not fully entering. Third, a change in the men closest to the door, a stiffening, a turning of heads, a sudden quiet as if conversation had been cut with a knife. Then, after the figure moved on, the room's noise would return, but slightly altered. People speaking more softly, as if trying not to draw attention. The nurse tried to treat this as one treats any recurring trouble, by tracing it to a practical cause. She asked whether any patients were known to wander. She asked whether any man had been assigned to check the wards for supplies. She asked indirectly whether any Confederate orderly was moving through the building after dark. No one could give her a satisfying answer. There were, however, oddities in the record. A list of patients in one ward showed a blank space where a name should have been, followed by a later correction in different ink. A note about a transfer had no receiving signature. A request for extra blankets was entered twice, as though copied from a previous day. Such errors were common in the chaos, yet the nurse's attention fixed on them because they seemed to gather around the same hours. The late evening, the period when lanterns were lowered, when the human voice tends toward confession. One night, she wrote of hearing a sound in the hallway that was not quite a footstep, not a shuffle, not a drag, a light tap, repeated at an interval, as if something hard, metal perhaps, touched wood and lifted again. She associated it, she said, with the visitor, because it ceased when he was no longer seen. But she would not claim that it was caused by him. She wrote, "It stopped after." In her next entry, she wrote about an ordinary event, a new wagon of wounded arriving, the work of settling them, the difficulty of finding space. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added that one of the new arrivals, an Ohio boy, barely old enough to shave, asked upon being laid down, had he been here? The nurse asked, "Who?" The boy's face tightened, as if he regretted speaking. He said, a man that goes room to room." The nurse wrote that she did not answer him, not because she wished to deceive, but because she realized that her silence might be safer than her words. In such a place, a rumor could become a sickness of its own. The slow build was not the visitor alone. It was what the visitor did to the hospital's mind. Because the wards were full of men who watched, who listened, who were half awake by necessity. When 3, 4, 5 people independently described the same figure, without agreement on his face, his age, his purpose, his origin, the careful mind searches for a shared explanation. A chaplain, a clerk, a medical inspector, and yet none of the likely roles fit the small details. No greeting, no questions, no clipboard, no visible work. Only the stopping, only the looking, only the moving on. The nurse began to pay attention to what happened afterward. In the morning, the men who had been most alert during the visitor's passage often asked to be moved farther from the door. One asked to be taken to the tents instead of the building. Another asked for a transfer to any hospital that would take him. When asked why, they gave ordinary answers: air, light, noise, anything that sounded reasonable. But their eyes gave a different explanation. And then there was a matter that the nurse wrote down with a kind of reluctant precision, that in 2 instances within a day of the visitor being seen in a certain ward, a patient in that ward died. Not violently, not strangely, simply in the way men died there every hour. The nurse did not claim the visitor caused it. She did not say he foretold it. She only observed that the timing struck her, and she hated that it struck her, because it made her feel as though she had become superstitious. The next time she saw the visitor, she forced herself to behave normally. She stepped into the corridor with her lamp held steady, and she called out politely, as she would any patient, "Sir, are you needing assistance?" The figure paused. From her description, he did not turn fully toward her. He only angled his head, as if weighing whether her voice belonged to the building or not. Then he continued on, and she wrote the most chilling part of the entry in a single restrained sentence. He did not look wounded. That is all. No more. In a hospital after Gettysburg, to see a patient who did not look wounded, who did not look like he belonged to place, was to feel the rules of the world loosened slightly. Not enough to break, just enough to sway. By late July, the hospital smell had become its own geography. A person could tell where she was in the building not by signs, but by the mixture of soap, sweat, food, damp cloth, and the sickly sweet note that no amount of vinegar could fully drown. In letters written from Gettysburg, nurses spoke of the constant strain, the emotional labor as much as the physical, of tending men who call for their mothers, their wives, their sweethearts, the woodlands. In such a landscape, even ordinary silence could feel like a warning. The nurse's notes show a gradual shift. Fewer descriptions of her own fatigue, more careful attention to the doorway. She began to sit where she could see the corridor, without appearing to watch it. She learned which boards creaked and which did not. She learned the sound of a surgeon's boots, the lighter step of a chaplain, the soft rush of skirts. The visitor's passage did not match any of them. It was not the step that terrified her, but the absence of small human noises, the cough before a greeting, the clearing of the throat, the rustle of cloth against a wall. She wrote twice that he seemed to arrive as if the hall had produced him, not as if he had approached from the stairs. In the last week of July, Pennsylvania Hall was still in use, but there was talk everywhere of consolidation, of moving men out of scattered buildings and into the larger organized hospital encampment outside town, the General Hospital described in period captions Library of Congress. The nurse wrote that transfers increased, that wagons came and went, that names were called and missed, that men were carried out who had been alive at dawn and silent by noon. It was in that restless shifting that the visitor became, paradoxically, easier to see, because when a place is in motion, the still things stand out. One evening, a matron from another ward came to her with a practical complaint. Certain patients were becoming difficult at night, refusing laudanum, refusing sleep, insisting the lamps remain higher. The matron spoke of it in the irritated tone of someone who had too much work to indulge nervousness. But then, after a pause, she admitted that she had seen the same figure in her doorway. "I thought it was one of the men sent to count us," the matron said. "To count?" the nurse asked. The matron made a small gesture, uncomfortable with her own words. "You know, as they do, they come to see what is needed." But the nurse knew that supply men asked questions. They carried paper. They spoke. This one did not. The matron lowered her voice. He did not ask after anything. He only stood where the light reaches, and then went on. That night, the nurse resolved to do what she had avoided, to follow, not closely, not with any intention of confrontation, only to see whether the visitor truly went each ward, and whether there was any rational end point. She told herself she was being sensible. A wandering patient could be a danger to himself and others. A confused man could fall downstairs. The hospital needed order, and if she could identify him, she could have him guided back to his bed. These were good reasons. And yet, when she wrote it later. Her tone suggested she knew those reasons were not the whole truth. She simply wrote, "I went after." The corridor was long and dim, with lanterns spaced too far apart. Between pools of light were stretches of murk, where the walls seemed to withdraw. Her lamp was a small comfort, but also a liability. It announced her presence. It made her visible. She saw him at the far end, already at the doorway of another room. He did not go in. He paused, long enough that she could have spoken if she wished. Instead, she held her breath and watched. In the room he paused at, a man began to mutter, not words, only sound like a prayer without language. Another man, awake, whispered, "Not here." A third began to weep, silently, with his face turned toward the wall. The nurse's hands tightened around the lamp handle. Then the visitor moved on. He went to the next doorway, and the same change happened. The room altered, as if the air thickened around the threshold. She could not see faces clearly from the hall, but she could hear the shift. Conversation faltering, breath catching, bed springs creaking as bodies tensed. Ward after ward, it repeated, and still no one called out to him, not because they did not see, but because in a place where men were stripped of privacy and dignity, there remained one last instinct. Do not invite what you cannot name. When the visitor reached the stair, he did not descend. He stood at the top, his body angled as if listening to a sound below. The nurse waited, expecting him to go down to the lower floors, to continue his methodical route. Instead, he turned, slowly, and began to walk toward her. This is where the nurse's writing changes. The lines grow tighter. The descriptions become shorter, as if she could not bear to linger. She wrote that she felt a great cold in her chest, though the night was warm. She wrote that the corridor seemed longer than it ought to be. She wrote that her lamp flame went low without wind, and she feared it would go out. The visitor approached, still at that measured pace. As he drew close, she tried to see his face. The light did not help her. It was not darkness that obscured him, not exactly. It was as if her eyes could not settle on the features in a way that felt certain. She could see the shape of a head, the suggestion of hair, the line of a collar, but the face itself, she wrote, would not stay. That phrase could mean many things. Exhaustion, smoke, shadows, the flicker of the lamp. She did not interpret it. She only recorded that, as he came within a few paces, she smelled something that did not belong in the hospital. Not vinegar, not soap, not blood. Something like wet earth after a summer storm, when the first rain opens the ground. Then he stopped beside her, not in front of her, but beside, close enough that she felt the air shift. He did not speak. He did not reach for her lamp. He did not touch her. He simply stood, looking into the room behind her, Ward D, where the sickest men lay. The nurse realized, with an unpleasant clarity, that he was not looking at her at all. He was looking past her, at the ward, and she, standing there with her lamp, had become only an obstruction between him and the room he meant to see. She forced herself to speak again, in the calm tone she used with frightened patience. "Sir," she said softly, "are you seeking someone?" A pause. Then, in her account, she wrote that he made a sound, not a word, but a breath drawn in a way that resembled recognition, as if he had found the right room. And then he stepped forward and crossed the threshold. The nurse followed, because she could not do otherwise, because this was her ward, and she could not allow an unknown man to stand among the beds in the dark. Inside Ward D, the lanterns were lower, the men were quieter. Their bodies had learned stillness from pain. The nurse felt the room tighten with attention. The visitor moved between beds, not like a nurse, not like a surgeon, like someone inspecting a field after harvest, reading what remains. He stopped at the bed of a man who had been delirious all day, calling names, singing fragment hymns, then falling silent. The visitor stood at the bedside. The delirious man opened his eyes, and for the first time in days, the man's gaze was clear. He stared at the visitor as if he recognized him. The delirious man's lips moved. The nurse leaned closer, thinking he might be asking for water. Instead, the man whispered very distinctly, "You're late." That was the last coherent sentence he spoke. The nurse wrote that she wanted to step between the visitor and the bed. She did not. That detail matters, because it shows a peculiar paralysis that can take a competent person when the world behaves almost normally, when nothing attacks. Nothing leaps. Nothing can be pointed to as a clear threat. Yet the wrongness is so strong that it empties the muscles. The visitor stood at the delirious man's bedside for a long minute. In that minute, the ward changed in a way the nurse struggled to describe without sounding foolish. The men who could turn their heads did so. The men who could not turn their heads shifted their eyes. A man in the corner began to whisper the Lord's Prayer without moving his lips, as if speaking with the inside of his mouth. The nurse watched her lamp flame. It had steadied again, but it burned low, as though the oil had become thick. Then the visitor moved on. He went to the next bed, where a boy from New York lay half asleep. The boy's bandaged arm rested on his chest like a separate object. The visitor paused, and the boy's eyes opened. The boy's expression did not show fear first. It showed disappointment, like a child seeing an unwelcome guest arrive. He said, in a hoarse whisper, "Not you." The visitor did not respond. He continued down the row. At the third bed, an older man, one who had asked days earlier to be told he was not here, began to tremble. The nurse stepped closer, intending to calm him. The older man clutched her wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let him count me." The nurse's throat tightened. She tried to answer, but no words came. Because what could she say? That there is no counting? That there is no visitor? That she is only tired? Meanwhile, the visitor stood at the foot of the bed, his head angled slightly downward, as if taking the man's face, the number of breaths, the thin margin of remaining life. The visitor then turned and looked directly at the nurse. This was the first time she felt his attention on her. She wrote that it was like stepping into cold water. Not painful, but immediate. She held the lamp up slightly higher, as if more light could make him resolve into an ordinary man. She willed herself to see details, eye color, scars, anything. The face still would not stay. But she did see one thing clearly enough to record: his shirt. A patient's shirt loosely tied, like those worn in the wards. Except the cloth was too clean. Not newly washed clean. Hospitals had washing, after all. Clean, as if it had never been worn in a hospital at all. The visitor looked at her, and in that moment the nurse felt a sudden certainty. Not of the supernatural, not of any spirit or apparition, but of something simpler and more humanly terrifying. That the visitor did not belong to the hospital's disorder. He belonged to the hospital's order. He belonged to the way the place sorted men, quietly, finally, into those who would leave and those who would not. The nurse's account becomes very restrained here. She does not describe any dramatic gesture. She does not write that the visitor spoke in a voice like wind. She does not claim he vanished. Instead, she writes of a single action that, in a place like that, carries immense weight. He reached down to the bedside table where the older man's tin cup sat, and he moved it slightly so that it sat closer to the man's hand. A small kindness, a practical adjustment, the kind of thing a nurse might do, and that, more than anything, unsettled her, because if the visitor was cruel, she could have rejected him. If he was theatrical, she could have dismissed him. But kindness made him harder to name. After moving the cup, the visitor walked on. He completed the ward, bed by bed. Then he returned to the doorway. Before leaving, he paused and looked back, not at the nurse, but at the room itself, as if taking a final impression. The nurse realized then that she had been holding her breath for far too long. When she finally inhaled, the air tasted stale and sweet. The visitor stepped into the corridor. The nurse followed him out, driven by the need to see where he went, to confirm he had a bed somewhere, a place in the hospital's ledger. Her lamp cast a weak oval of light around her feet. In the corridor, the visitor did not turn left or right. He went to the stairs. He descended. The nurse followed to the landing, then stopped. She did not go farther. Below, the stairwell was darker, and she could hear other sounds, the low murmur of another ward, the distant clink of instruments, the cough of a man awake in the night. She held the lamp up, trying to see him. She saw him reach the lower floor. Then, very calmly, he turned and went into a room that she knew was empty, an overflow room that had been cleared for the next day's transfers. A room with no beds in it, no patients, nothing. The nurse waited. A minute passed, then another. She did not hear footsteps returning. She did not hear movement inside. She did not hear a door close. At last, she gathered herself and went down, her lamp trembling only slightly now, because fear, once prolonged, becomes a kind of dull tool. She reached the empty room. The door was open. The room was empty. No man, no shadow, only the smell of old wood and the faint dampness of stone walls cooling in summer night. The nurse wrote. There was nowhere for him to go. That is the peak incident as she recorded it. No chase, no scream, no spectacle, only an ordinary impossibility. And then, as if the hospital itself had decided the matter was finished, the night returned to its usual labors. In the days afterward, the consequences were subtle but real. She noted that the matron who had spoken to her refused to discuss it again. The steward avoided the corridor after dark. A convalescent man who had been able to walk began insisting on sleeping with his face toward the wall. A Confederate patient, one who had earlier spoken of counting, was transferred out the next morning, and the nurse never learned where. Most telling of all, the nurse stopped writing about the visitor, not because she forgot, but because, as she wrote in a later line, to set it down gives it shape. That is how the aftermath appears in the record, as a silence. The broader historical record of Gettysburg Hospitals is full of crowded wards and overwhelming need of nurses and surgeons laboring in conditions that strain the limits of Organization New York Times archive. Pennsylvania Hall's long legacy includes later remarks about blood-stained floors and even bones uncovered during construction work decades afterward. Details that show how long the battle's physical traces endured National Museum of Civil War Medicine. But the visitor is not part of any official report. He survives only in the margins, in the reluctance, in the way certain entries are missing dates, in the way, after a particular night, the nurse's handwriting grows smaller, tighter, as if she wished to take up less space in the world. As August wore on, the great work of removal continued. Men were shipped to larger hospitals in Baltimore, Harrisburg, and beyond. The temporary wards in churches and colleges were slowly cleared. Gettysburg, bruised and exhausted, began the long, practical task of becoming a town again. And yet, the hospitals did not end so much as they thinned, leaving behind traces that were not always written down. In Pennsylvania Hall, the official history tells us of rooms crowded with wounded, of Confederate men left behind because they could not be moved, of surgeons and nurses, Union and Confederate, working in the same space because necessity permitted no other arrangement in National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Those facts alone are enough to make the building feel heavy with memory. The tent hospital outside town, the general hospital capable of holding thousands, was recorded in period captions and photographed, leaving us at least one still image of wounded men and nurses framed by canvas and Summerlight Library of Congress. The photograph is calm in a way reality could not have been. Men sitting, standing, waiting. The camera cannot capture the sounds or the long nights or the private moments when a patient stares at the tent wall as though it were a horizon. From the nursing narratives, we know that women move through this landscape with steadiness that still startles the modern mind. They wrote letters to the dying, brought water, scavenged supplies, tried to bring a measured gentleness into places built for emergency New York Times archive. Emily Souter's writings preserve the intimate rituals. The lock of hair, the oak leaves, the letter finished late at night, by a small flame to woodlands. Those are the kinds of acts that do not appear in official ledgers, yet define what the hospitals meant to the people inside them. The visitor, this unnamed patient who visited each ward, belongs to that same category of unofficial truth, not provable in the way a casualty figure is provable, not confirmable in a government record, and yet persistent in the way a repeated human observation can be. After the night of the empty room, the nurse's surviving pages show a careful retreat. She wrote less about impressions and more about tasks. She described transfers. She listed supplies. She noted weather. In a single later entry, she mentioned that a man in ward A spoke of the quiet visitor, but she did not elaborate. Then there is a gap, several days missing. Whether those pages were lost or removed or never written cannot be known, but the gap sits in the sequence like a closed door. When her writing resumes, it is in a different location, suggesting she may have been transferred herself or moved with patients to another hospital site. She does not name the place. She only notes that the work continues. And that is perhaps the most historically plausible outcome for such a story. Not a dramatic ending, but absorption. The war swallowed odd experiences the way it swallowed the ordinary ones. People did not always have leisure to interpret what they had seen. They simply carried it. There are small, indirect echoes of this in the way communities remember such places. Even in official historical writing about Pennsylvania Hall, there's acknowledgement that blood-stained floors and unsettling reminders persisted long after the wounded were gone. National Museum of Civil War Medicine. The building remained. The town remained. People walked those hallways again under different circumstances, and yet some part of the past remained pressed into the wood. The nurse's fragment ends without conclusion. There is no final claim, no declaration of haunting, no attempt to persuade, only a quiet reflection that reads, to me, like the most honest line she could write, that a hospital has its own visitors, those we expect and those we do not, and we learn in time not to ask too much of the night. If the visitor was simply a confused patient, the pattern remained strange. The ward-by-ward method, the way multiple witnesses describe him as purposeful. If he was an orderly or clerk, the lack of speech and the absence from lists is difficult to explain. If he was nothing more than a shared hallucination of exhausted minds, then it is remarkable how consistent the details became across people who did not speak openly to one another. And so the event remains where the nurse left it, in that narrow space between explanation and mystery. In the end, Gettysburg became a word carved in stone, a site of ceremonies, a lesson taught to school children. The battle belongs to history books, but the hospitals belong to the night. They belong to lamplight and whispered names and the sound of footsteps in hallways meant for study or prayer, and in at least one nurse's careful hand. They also belong to a patient who had no name in the ledger, who moved as if he knew the route, who paused at each doorway as if listening, and who left behind no proof except the way people remember to hold their breath when the corridor grew quiet. As if, even long after the wagons rolled away and the tents came down, the building itself still expected someone to pass through, slowly, without hurry, checking each ward, one after another, until the lamps went low. And then, just before sleep takes you, you may find yourself listening for a footstep that does not quite sound like one.